Welcome to the Consulting Leaders Podcast, where we talk about the business of consulting. Whether you're looking to grow your practice or learn from the stories of leaders in consulting, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Guillaume Jouvencel, ex-PwC and co-founder of GHA Marketing. Join me as I interview the best consultants in their niche. Let's get on with the show. Mike, talk to me about strategic communications and how does one get into this field?
Well, that's a good question. It's funny. We have this term in our field called strategic communications, which I can't stand. I really think that it misrepresents everything because, for the most part, I came up. I'll give you a little bit of my background. I was a journalist for 8 years, and I worked in politics for a couple of years as a communications director for a mayor up in the Northeast. And when I got into PR agency life, public relations agency life, this term strategic communications comes around a lot. And, it occurs to me sort of like, well, what would be the opposite of that? Hopefully what you're doing, if you're working with a big PR firm in Manhattan, is that what you're doing is strategic by nature. But I do think strategy is a totally different question. And so I've tried to build a firm. I think this goes to your question. That is, we do both strategy consulting, and I'll talk about what our focus areas are, and communications. And I think the two go very well hand in hand because so much of what you have to say has to do with what you choose to do, right? So the choices that you're making on the strategy side around resource allocation, around how you want to build your brand, around your brand platform, around the things in the world that you want to have an impact on beyond your product line, those things are really critical. But they're not just questions for a PR firm to handle. You actually need to get deeper into the substrate of the brand. You need to understand what it means for the business. You need to sometimes just do some math. And so those things are what I describe as the strategy side of the house. And, we're not afraid to do math on the communication side either. But, really have to think a lot more structurally, think about communications as an asset and a system within companies. And I found that in my career, in the public relations agency world, we would talk a good game on that front, but didn't actually have those capabilities. And so that's where strategy and communication sort of comes from.
I mean, I like that you start the interview with, I hate the term. Well, this is the very first question that I'm asking you. I'm like, I was spot on then.
Well, in fairness to you, not only do we talk about strategy and communication. So I just look around. If you Google strategic communications, the whole world of public relations and marketing agencies will be at your feet.
We work with a few PR consultants, and I confirm.
That's great.
All right. So explain to us what problem you're solving with Orange Fiery now. Like, what is it that you help people solve for?
Well, this is a very difficult question because we help solve multiple problems. So I would just let me lay this out a little bit from my standpoint in terms of a thesis and see where it takes us. First of all, I think we're living in an era of the intangibles economy. Okay, so if you look at who the largest companies in 1975 were, you were talking about companies that made things. You're talking about, Exxon or Mobil at the time. You were talking about GE. You're talking about big industrial conglomerates. They had a lot of assets. These assets had value. That was, what they were all about. If you fast forward 50 years now, we have a very clear flip where the biggest companies of the world are companies that mean things. So you have Apple, you have Microsoft, you have NVIDIA. These are not asset-rich companies. The amount of assets on their balance sheet, tangible assets, was 80% for the 5 largest companies in the world in 1975. It now represents 20% of the market value of the 5 largest companies in the world. So that puts us in a very different era. Now, I'm not, I actually can do math, so I did want to make sure that you were clear that I don't think that everything that is intangible represents communications, but a good portion of it does. And we can't really pinpoint exactly what that is because there's a lot there in terms of IP value and other things that fit into that mold. However, if you look at things competitively, if you look at what drives stock markets up and down, if you look at what drives enterprise value, a lot of this has to do, we feel, with the corporate brand. It has to do with things where communications is fundamental to what happens. So it's about, yes, your external positioning, sometimes your internal communications work. Have you built a communication system that allows inputs from the outside into your strategy world? Have you created something where you've got the engagement with the right stakeholders to take your business forward? Are you agile enough to react to things that are happening in the marketplace, but not, react too quickly, too much? Stand your ground, if you will, on the things that you have purpose around. To me, these are all things that benefit a great deal from a combination of sort of higher level strategy, what we want to achieve, and boots on the ground reality, right? And that is a gap that many firms fail to be able to bridge, and it's challenging to bridge. I have had the experience of working in a boardroom with a corporate board and saying, we want to change direction, and then trying to guide my team through the execution of communications materials around that launch. And it's a distance, and you find yourself in the weeds on data, but really still trying to fulfill a vision. And I think it's hard work, but it's important work. And so, and that particular thing I'm thinking of was very well done. A lot to do with the internal communications team at the company too. So we think that these worlds have to, get a little closer to each other. That strategy has to be something that you can articulate well, that you can, reach the right stakeholders, move them in the direction where you want them to be for the future, navigate the complexities of a multi-stakeholder environment, and that those are not simply things that have to do with writing press releases or thought leadership pieces or things of that nature. They're connected, but they're not, the work of PR firms.
I'm going to throw a curveball at you here, Mike. I hope you won't be pissed at me for that. You're in communication. You probably know that clear and simple beats complex and fancy every single day of the week, twice on Sundays. I hear you. And obviously when you mentioned Apple, so let's just mention this company, right? If you go and start helping out Apple with their communication and their strategic communication, it's not just going to be like, say iPhone good, people buy iPhone, win the game. Of course, there's going to be multiple components, multiple complexities, multiple buyer persona. What's the benefits that people get working with Orange Fiery?
I think the benefits really are a strategy that'll work in the real world and not something that sits on a shelf. I think they get something that's sustained in terms of ongoing feedback into the mix of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. I agree with you on simple is better, but you want to make things as simple as possible and no simpler. So I think what we found with our clients, it's a very unpredictable set of feedback that we get from people in terms of what they've loved that we've done. Because I do believe as a firm, we're generalists who are very focused on connecting organizations with the stakeholders who are going to be critical to their success. Mm-hmm. So here's an example of that, right? What do they get? And I actually will say, I do find this very hard to articulate sometimes. We had a client who was trying to figure out, and make a pivot in their messaging. In large part, we do a lot of work with biotechs and with pharma companies. And so this was in large part because they were starting now to move out of the phase 1 trials into larger pivotal trials that would lead them on a path to approval. So they had to start thinking about what's commercial looking like? How am I talking to the patients who have this, condition that we're going to treat? How do I talk to the key opinion leaders, the prescribers in the space? And what was interesting, we ran them through a set of exercises, the executive team, around messaging, really trying to bring some insights from the marketplace into their world. And it was a good exercise. I do remember some skepticism going into it and people feeling really good coming out. But the chief medical officer pulled me aside a couple of weeks later and she said, you did something I don't think you did, and I want to point it out to you. Your team gave us a language to talk about the key issues that we were facing. And prior to that workshop, we were kind of all over the place. We had a number of upcoming inflection points, and we really needed to be able to talk amongst ourselves about what was meaningful in those moments, what our opportunities were, and what potentially the risks were. And the conversation that we had around messaging actually led them to a lexicon internally that they could use to talk about those issues. I do think that was a surprise to us. It wasn't really what we were aiming for, but organizing up your communications in a system, for a company, and that's a bit of how I think about these things. How do we give the company an asset, right? That often yields unexpected results like what I'm describing. But hopefully, and it's happened over and over again, the lexicon, our messaging, refreshing a corporate brand, activating that brand in a direction, whether it's a purpose-driven brand or something that's an issue in the marketplace. Those are all things that, both elevate the brand, connect them more deeply with stakeholders, and candidly do seem to align with organizational success on an internal basis as well.
Biotech, pharma companies, are those the people the companies you typically work with? Like Do you have a specific industry, niche, company size?
Not
Who do you
exclusively.
help?
We do a lot of work with. We do a lot of work to take corporate brands at that point when they're in that regulatory pathway toward approval, and come in and very often refresh the brand to give it a little more substrate in terms of brand attributes and a brand narrative and things of that nature, and then support communications going forward.
I like that. Who's the decision maker, Mike, at this level? Like, who do you need to get into a room with to be like, you need help with this, let me help out?
Yeah, it's typically a chief commercial officer. It's definitely someone in the C-suite, for the most part, who's got to sort of say, this is an area where we have a need. So chief commercial officer, chief executive officer, sometimes it's a chief medical officer, because they recognize the same issues that go on their scientific narrative. And we've worked with those teams as well. If there are chief corporate and public affairs officers, usually at a larger company, or chief communications officer, usually at a larger company, we might work with them on, their work or a portion of their portfolio. We do some work in the social impact space. So if they have a corporate foundation, if they have an advocacy strategy, things of that nature, that's often a chunk that we'll take on, because again, if part of our mission is to connect you with the stakeholders who are critical to your success, patient advocacy or other third-party advocacy work is very often a part of that portfolio.
So in my little notes, whilst I'm listening to you, I've noted a little equation that I'm going to read out to you. So corporate brands plus C-suites equals hard to reach. How do you get in touch with those people? How do you get in the room to be like, you're a chief medical officer? It's a very interesting ICP, by the way. And here is how I can help. Like, what has worked for you to get the attention of those decision makers and to maybe sit a bit in their pain so that they're like, yeah, we need to talk to you, Mike, and we need to see how we can work together?
Well, a lot of it is my network. Historically, at one point in my life, I was the global client relationship manager for my firm's Pfizer business. And so I worked with a lot of people who were senior directors of marketing or commercial in that mix, or in communications, and they've since gone on to other things. So that I've been very fortunate in the network orientation to have people out there who are in decision-making roles now. I grew up, they grew up, if you will. But then also your reputation. I mean, I do know we don't sort of get the inbounds that I remember getting when I was at a big PR firm. But we often get people who have spoken to someone that has been our client in the past about a problem that they're having and has come our way as a result of that. So those are, largely the places that we get them. I do try to keep reaching out on a pretty regular basis to my network to stay in touch with people who I've known historically and who I, might be open to what we're doing or interested in having us help. So that's sort of how we cultivate things.
So network. What else have you done that worked for you, Mike, to maybe not get into the room directly with them, but to communicate strategically on your brand, on your company? Like, what has worked for you marketing-wise that people listening to us can learn from, to be like, this is how I get the attention to the corporate brands and potentially get the attention of the C-suite executives?
I mean, we do some webinars here and there. We'll do some partnerships around things like narrative architecture. That's a topic that we talk about a lot. But I guess essentially thought leadership through LinkedIn or through our newsletter and things of that nature. But it's not, I do think this is sort of a trust sale. I mean, historically, knowing people is helpful. Getting a brief to be able to respond to it is helpful. We don't do a lot of RFP responses. We really want to work on specific problem sets that we can clearly identify so that we can deliver value to our clients. But at the same time, there's a whole world out there of PR firms, communications firms, and consulting firms for that matter, who are built with this infrastructure to respond to RFPs and to, do outbound cold calling or outreach. I'm not saying there aren't people out there that we can help that we're not reaching. There probably are quite a few, but at the same time, we don't think that putting our resources into, RFP publishing responses is the right way to build our business.
Talk to me about this trust-based selling. It's very funny because we recently started working with the consultants who trains company to do exactly that. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to get your take on how you do that in the biotech, the pharma industry, like at the level you're playing at, how do you do trust-based selling? And I'm going to add one thing. I had a guest say something that I keep on quoting her on, which is, we live in a trust recession age, because anybody can claim anything on the internet. We have ChatGPT helping us out, creating fantastic LinkedIn posts. So how do you do that? How do you sell whilst building and keeping trust?
I mean, I think that's a challenging question right now because of what you just said. You know, my old firm, Edelman, just did their trust barometer, which they do annually, talking about the state of trust across industry sectors and across, kind of media and business and government and NGOs. And it would seem we're at a real trust deficit. And we did a study along with a group called the IW Group on civility and saw a similar pattern that, you know, people are kind of feeling very isolated, damaged, you know, a lot of effects for what's happening in the world right now. I think, you know, trust is rooted in, can I deliver on the thing that I said I can deliver on? And so I think of it slightly differently. It's sort of, trust has to be there at some level. You have to be able to cultivate it. You have to expect that it's there at the outset. So there's, I think, a little bit of an assumption around trust. But at the same time, I think of what we do as solution-based selling. So it's really about identifying a problem with enough sort of detail that you can tackle it, right? Because usually we're dealing with problems that are not your straightforward. Like if there's a balance sheet problem, if you want to understand how to refinance something so that, you know, your lease for a warehouse is going to be, you know, a little more affordable, or there's a tax benefit to it, don't call us. You know, that's not our sphere. But if you do have one of these sort of complex, multifactorial problems, multi-stakeholder problems that requires a little bit of, you know, sort of breaking it down in a clear way, aligning your executive team around a solution, and then going and executing and trying to make progress on it, we can do that. So I think for me, it probably is helpful that I'm relying a lot on my network of past clients who've seen us do that before. Because we did have an instance, I remember in the early going, where someone said, I don't see how you can do that. And then, you know, 6 months later, they were like, oh, wow, you did that, you know. And obviously everything we're doing is in partnership with the clients too. So I don't know. It's a great question, honestly. How do you really cultivate trust? I think a lot of it is not trying to cultivate trust, but rather trying to do the work and see that trust is an outcome of that process.
Oh, that's super interesting. I warned you I was doing this before the recording, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to challenge this here. It starts, I don't know if it starts there. It's essential. Like, doing a good job is, like, I want to say, we need to do that. Like, this is how you maintain, improve, grow a relationship, and potentially work together with the clients for many, many years. I think in 2026, at the moment we're recording this episode, because people will still be listening to this in 2056, I think being able to build trust out there on LinkedIn, on your website, on social media, on YouTube, on podcast platforms, is kind of peeling the onion and already showcasing proof that you can do what you say you can do, by showcasing expertise, showcasing case studies, showcasing like that you're an SME, so that when you start entering into the conversations with the right people, yes, they probably won't hand you, you know, a check of multiple six figures, but they'll be like, yeah, I've seen you, or I've heard you, or I've read through your website, or I've seen your process. That makes sense. Talk to me about it. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. We need to deliver an exceptional work. No choice. When you find ways to build that trust even before you get into the first conversation, I think this is where you have faster sales process. You keep on building that trust throughout it, but it has been like the foundations have been laid, let's say. That's my take. What do you think?
I struggle with this because, candidly, I see a lot of material on LinkedIn that's posing as thought leadership, but it uses the word I too much. And I've used I too much in this podcast. So, you know, to be honest with you, I'm a little uncomfortable on that myself. You know, I think it's a challenging situation we find ourselves in, where, you know, it seems like we are competing in something a friend of mine describes as the attention economy. And, you know, our reaction for the most part in competing in that world is to say, look at me, look at me, look at me. Reminds me of a Dr. Seuss book I used to read my kids. So, I think we do have to be putting ourselves out there. When I started the business 12 years ago, I remember a former colleague of mine had said, don't be out in front of your clients taking positions on things in the world. Work through the clients. They're smarter than you in many respects. They're more exposed than you, unless you're talking about someone else who's in the same industry. It's real for them in a way it may not be for you. So if you want to talk about drug prices, a very complicated topic, right? Which I happen to know a fair amount about. If you want to talk about that, great. But for the most part, the real action is to help your clients navigate that world and do well with it. And I agree with that principle. I see a lot of people out there who seem very oriented toward positioning themselves as the smartest person in the room, even when there's not a room. I feel like my job is to, continue to put myself out there and certainly give people a chance. I wouldn't be doing a podcast otherwise, right? Give people a chance to hear what we're working on, hear a little bit about our process and the rest of it, and see if we might be the right fit for them. But I've also seen that we are not the right fit for lots of folks. And so I would rather have clients who, to your point, understand a little bit about the approach. We don't make any progress if we're not working with clients. So it's really about them, and being, if I dare say, trying to have humility as a virtue, right? As a company, we're in an age where that's a little tough. But I would stand by that, because for the most part, consulting's tough. You position yourselves as the geniuses. There's always that joke, what is a consultant? It's someone who borrows your watch to tell you the time. We really want to change that, right? We really want to have a different reputation in terms of the value that we add. And so I'll sort of endure a little bit of like, who are you again? In terms of the introductions and the opportunities there, maybe even some skepticism about our ability to deliver. If it winds up getting us to a place where we're genuinely connecting with people and able to, solve a real problem.
I like that a lot. And that does make a lot of sense. So just on the I love that we're going so deep on trust, but I think that's the number one challenge of consultants in 2026. Let's face it. This, and how do we adapt with the technology that is popping out everywhere? I think there is nothing wrong with the I, but I very much align with you with the fact that it must not be too frequent. I had that conversation with a guest recently where she was like, she just did a breakdown of like how she was organizing certain things to get the attention of the right customers. She was like, yeah, I think I'm good at this. I'm like, you're brilliant at this. What do you mean? She's like, yeah, you know, right. And I'm like, I think one should say what they are exceptional at. Now, there is a caveat to this. When you take that position and I kick ass at podcasts, and I'm very bad at other things, paid ads, for instance. I don't know anything about it. I think it's fine to say I'm good at, as long as you also show the other side of the coin and you're honest, candid, and transparent. And I think that's the thing that consultants miss, because I was a consultant in a Big Four myself before. We get rewarded for being the expert in the room, the one that people, turn their eyes to get the answers, to tell them the time, although they are just watching out their own watch. I like the expression, by the way. So I think there is just a balance to be done now between the I and and this is what I'm struggling with right now. This is how I'm planning to solve this, but full transparency and honesty. Tell me a bit more about how you retain clients, Mike. So once you've established that trust, you start working with them. What does retention look like when you work with, the chief medical officers of corporate companies?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, they're coming back to us. And in our world, a lot of times the people who are in this ecosystem, maybe they come back as a fractional chief medical officer, or maybe they're onto a new role after each one passes. It depends, because candidly, we're not always trying to do the same assignment over and over again. We're not a consultant. I mean, we do have certain offerings that we have done and kind of honed to a point, I think, of real unique expertise in the marketplace. But at the same time, we're not out there trying to do the same widget over and over again. So it does, what's happened with us is not only that our clients, a set of them, come back to us regularly, but also that they are encouraging their colleagues when they, hit a problem that has the same kind of complexity to it that we tend to excel at, will come up as a referral, and we'll get the phone calls that way. So, but we've had the joy really of having clients come back to us, half a dozen or more times in different roles with new challenges that, it's like, good, we're getting the band back together and we're going to take the next hill. So we're very fortunate on that front. We've really, been blessed when it comes to that.
I like that for you. What's your number one challenge? I feel we've kind of already alluded to that. But like, what is the nut that you're trying to crack right now, Mike? That once you crack, you're gonna take Orange Fiery to the next level, if that's even the goal, right? And if not, like, what's the one challenge that you're trying to solve for right now?
I mean, I think I don't necessarily think of it that way, although it is clearly an imperative to grow a business. I feel like for me right now, I see opportunity in what's happening in the biotech space. It's been a very difficult couple of years from a funding perspective. Our work will shift, right? So we've gone from, helping public companies with their earnings and with their, stakeholder outreach and dealing with, in one case, dealing with everything from a war to in terms of their internal operations to, FDA approval to reorganizations and restructurings to activist investors and board challenges. So we've done a breadth of work that's very much, kind of on the leading edge of where a company's headed, all the way back to helping companies for the last couple of years put their investor pitch together, help, to position their company and then go out and try to raise money. And what's happened in our space in the last 2 years has been, the XBI has been pretty flat. A lot of the general money going into biotechs has stopped. People are, VCs are looking for, or other funders, early stage funders are looking for liquidity. They're looking for exits. And that's just sort of brought things to a bit of a crawl. And so now I'm looking forward to a comeback. And then how do we, as a company, as I've described, that's sort of, I would like to think, helping to solve some of the bigger problems on the balance sheet, if you will, intangibles that, in that focus area. Hopefully there's going to be quite a few IPOs this year. How can we get connected to the right people who are going to be leading some of that work? Because that's obviously communications and positioning is critical to that. A number of companies are moving forward with plans for product launches, FDA activity, things like that. How do we make sure that we're in the right place at the right time with the right offer for that work? So there's a challenge there just in organizing ourselves up, and putting ourselves out there in a way that's productive.
I appreciate that a lot. On the other side, what is the biggest opportunity that you're seeing in your space in 2026 and beyond even?
Well, I mean, I guess maybe it flips a little bit. Like in our space, there's going to be a lot of talent out there. I think, what's happening in the communications, marketing, PR area, with the giant mergers and, a lot of consolidation is going to lead to, I mean, also, we haven't really talked about it, but the role of AI in all of this is changing a lot of what's happening out there. And can we be nimble enough to benefit from that, both from getting the talent standpoint, but also from a retooling operations standpoint to kind of be as efficient as possible and use these tools in the right ways. I feel pretty good about where we're at on that front, but it's I know it's a challenge, and it'll be a challenge too as we bring the two together. People who may be coming into our organization who have a lot of experience, but maybe not as experienced with these tools. How do we make sure that they benefit from what we've figured out in the last couple of years?
Let's talk about it. What are your thoughts on AI? How do you think it's gonna? I mean, it's already changing the game, obviously, but like, how do you approach it at the level you're playing? Like, how do you see it impacting what you do, positively and negatively?
I mean, I happen to work in an industry where a big chunk of what we do is subject to hype. I think a couple of years ago, one of our competitor firms hired quote unquote hired the first AI account executive, and I thought that was very, I chuckled and I moved on. So here I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. I was a writer my whole life, and so when generative AI came along and said, "Look, we can write," I said, "That's very nice, but I don't know why I would use that." And that was my attitude for a while. And I also, I was living for a while in San Francisco area, and I kept querying people like, yeah, but do we really have AI? And I was talking about, AGI, right? Kind of the big question, which I think we know is, it's out there. We may get there someday. We're not there yet. And that's been true for 50 years, by the way. So I started to question myself a little bit, and I had a guy I respect a great deal, Jim O'Leary at Weber Shandwick, who I used to work with. We had drinks one night or dinner, and he kind of explained to me what he was doing and how useful he found it. So that made me revisit a lot of my assumptions about AI and its role in our business. And Jim's been very active in terms of how he uses it. He uses it differently than we do. He uses it for a lot of communications work, which I think is great. We've used it to support what we do. Like I took an MIT course on AI and business strategy so that I could understand better what it was. And they talked about it as the human machine collaboration. And I think about it that way too. So how can, we use AI to do the things that we do, but better, where we have expertise, where we know what good looks like as an output, where we can help shape things, but it's, part of our workflow. And I found it to be a remarkable assistant. I mean, when you're dealing with research and you're asking AI to do it, it can do a lot very quickly, and then you have to check a lot, and there's still a need for a human in the loop on many of these things. But it can help make our team smarter. We can have, very good research briefs right out of the gate when we're entering into a new industry, when we're onboarding with a new client, when we're, trying to understand the competitive landscape. Again, super helpful. It can help us quickly turn around and synthesize a lot of the internal interviews we do. We do a lot of qualitative research, and, with the firewalls and appropriate security and safeguards in place, we can have that as an input. Again, we've done the situation where we've done the scenario where we have AI do it on its own, and we have a human do it, and we look at the outputs, and the human outputs are still better. However, we combine the two, and they're quite powerful. And AI can help us see things we might not have seen, and it can also help us, just get there quicker on a few fronts. But I think it's a wonderful tool, and that collaboration is real. And I think you can, we've got it very actively built into our workflow at this point to help us be more efficient, less costly, it's kind of help us scale, honestly, which is really impressive.
Mike, ladies and gentlemen, Mike, if people want to find out more about you, see what you do, where should they go?
Check out our website, orangefiery.com. It's all one word. You can find me on LinkedIn at Mike Kuczkowski, although I apologize for my last name. It's Kuczkowski, as you'll probably see on some label. And pleasure chatting with you. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise, Mike. Thank you so much for coming on Consulting Leaders. We'll put all the links in the description. So for the people who cannot spell the name, don't worry. The link is in the description. For what I'm concerned, you've gained at least one new connection on LinkedIn. Me, I just added you. Mike, thank you so much for coming on Consulting Leaders.
My pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Leaders podcast. We hope you learned valuable lessons on how to grow your practice and take your business to the next level. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening to this show so you never miss an episode. To apply and be a guest on the show, click the link in the description. See you next time. How